everyone. I'm here to talk to you about my AP research presentation, my study on LGBTQ plus representation in film. So first of all, this is my research question. How do LGBTQ plus depictions in streamable films from 2015 to now differ in their representation quality when compared to older movies from 1980 to 2000 using a refined model of measurement? So I know this is a mouthful, but first we're going to talk about how I even got to this topic. So first of all, I did some presentations in AP seminar. One of mine was about suicide prevention in relation to social media. So that's where I got that film aspect from, really diving deep into how media impacts people. And then I also did a presentation on LGBTQ youth mental health. So that's how I chose the minority that I wanted to focus on. Additionally, the film industry has a long history of homophobia and censorship codes and production codes and things like that that prevented the portrayal of homosexuality on screen. And I really wanted to look at how these portrayals progressed over time. This leads me to the goal of my study, which is to use a model to observe and analyze the quality of representation. And I really wanted to be able to identify films and label them as high quality or low quality representation. So I'm asking the question for each film, is this high quality representation? And then after identifying these films, I really wanted to dive deeper into why I've labeled them that way, what criteria contributes to that representation. So I reviewed many studies surrounding LGBTQ plus representation, and I found that there were a few core themes. So the first major theme was visibility and tokenism. I found a study done by Rob Cover, who analyzed whether simple visibility, which is just the inclusion of characters on screen, or the themes behind their portrayals was more important when considering representation. And one thing to note is that visibility can often lead to tokenism, which is defined by including underrepresented groups solely for the purpose of display and not really giving much purpose behind their depictions. So that often results in a lot of shallow portrayals of these people. And this is actually really harmful because it stunts progress, because it gives the illusion of progressive change when really there isn't any substance behind the characters. And Cover found that there were actually there were high presences of negative depictions of queer people, so depicting them as villains or as socially inept and things like that, kind of implying that being queer is something to be ashamed of. So we can conclude that there is a lot of significance behind the themes, and visibility is not sufficient when considering representation. The second main theme that I found was depictions, connotations, and their impact on society. So first I have Deborah Fisher, who studied the frequency of sexual content related to non-heterosexual groups on TV, and she found that most of the content related to homosexuality was predominantly asexual. However, when there was sexual content involved, it was often over-sexualized. So we're seeing really extreme ends of the spectrum with no middle ground, which is more normalized. So these findings suggest that films are often insinuating that being queer is something abnormal. So they're suggesting that queer people need to hide their identities. And these insinuations are actually connotations which impact viewers. And this is something that Melissa Allen analyzed in her study about this graphic novel and TV show called Heartstopper, and how that impacts sexual identity development. And she found that storylines that positively depict certain sexualities actually can serve as a teaching mechanism for kids and discovering their identities. So through both of these sources, we can conclude that positive and negative depictions have those respective impacts on viewers. And that's really why it's important to understand how representation is portrayed on the screen. So that's really looking at those positive and negative portrayals and really understanding how those will impact people. So through these findings, I have found a prominent gap. So as I said, other researchers are mainly looking at how these portrayals have impacted audiences, which, as I said, displays the importance of maintaining accurate representation, but they don't really define what that representation is. So for what I'm going to do, I'm going to be looking at what we really should be expecting on screen, what the screen is literally showing us, and if that even exists, if high quality representation even exists right now. Additionally, there was nothing really listing out criteria for what films should include to constitute high quality representation, so I have created a way to measure that. So to fill this gap, I created my research question, but as I said, we're going to break it down. So first of all, I was looking at streamable films. So I did this because I believe it's more relevant today. Most people are viewing films from home, especially in a post-COVID world. It's just more relevant and accessible for people to view films at home. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be looking literally at what is happening on the screen to identify representation quality. This means taking into account how specific scenes portray queer people, but not looking at how it impacts audiences. And then I identified this timeline. I have 1 decade for the newer films and 2 decades for the older films. And I did this because in my preliminary research, I found that there was most likely just generally less existence of queer representation on screen, especially during times where society was a little less inclusive. And then the last piece of my question specifies how I'm going to conduct this analysis. As I said, my research has not uncovered any way to measure representation, so by creating my own model, I'm contributing to surrounding literature, and it could even be used in the future to evaluate upcoming film. So when answering this question, I first had to come up with my hypotheses. I hypothesized that older films will lack complexity in their characters, and additionally that fewer overall characters will be present in the films overall. For the newer films, I anticipate there to be more positivity, and also just a generally more natural incorporation of the characters into the storyline, and I expect there to be more complexity in their backgrounds and things like that. So as for my methodology, other researchers used a lot of surveys to really look at how audiences' opinions changed before and after viewing. But since I'm analyzing the films themselves and not how viewers are impacted, I decided to do a content analysis. And in doing a film content analysis, it's really important to get a more holistic understanding of the film. So I decided to look at both quantitative and qualitative data. So I chose to do a mixed methods analysis. As for my quantitative data, I did a similar methodology as Nish, who used a coding scheme to analyze the frequencies of certain depictions. But since I don't have access to more advanced coding schemes, I've decided to manually tally the frequency of certain scenes. And then for my qualitative data, I am looking at how certain scenes compare to categories that I've identified, which is similar to how Rudy conducted his study. Then I had to create my model. So I used categories that I identified from surrounding literature that other researchers have deemed important, or ones that I have found a lot of studies had in common in talking about. So this is an example of one of the lines of my model. I have the criteria listed with room for my observatory notes underneath, and then I have my analysis off to the side. And I separated these because it's a piece of qualitative research that's important in maintaining objectivity, separating observations from analysis. And I have 4 qualitative lines and 1 quantitative line, and each of them have a category. So for example, this one is complexity. So then when I was selecting my films, I used lists such as this one from IMDb and GLAAD that were lists of films containing queer themes, and I stayed within my identified timeline in order to find these films. So using this criteria, I picked the following older films. I have But I'm a Cheerleader from 1999, Maurice from 1987, and Beautiful Thing from 1996. Then for my newer films, I have It Chapter 2 from 2019, Carol from 2015, and Moonlight from 2016. When I was actually viewing my movies, at first I had to do a test data collection to test out my model, but another piece of this that was really important was having a second reviewer. So I did this, I viewed Heartstopper, which Alan talked about in her study, and I had that second reviewer to ensure objectivity so we could compare observations, we could compare how we analyze these things, and try to reduce a lot of that bias, as I would be the only one reviewing the true films. So once I actually viewed the films that I had selected, I tallied the depictions that I decided to count as I watched, and I also took observatory notes, and then I went back after I had viewed the films using my notes to compare to the criteria that I had listed to form my analysis. So after conducting this research, I compiled my quantitative analysis into graphs and my qualitative analysis from each movie into old versus new, so I could really make that comparison. So first of all, we have my quantitative data. In the blue are positive points, and these earned a score of +1. And this was really just things like positive coming out experiences, PDA without discrimination, more positive experiences in queer life. And I have negative points in red, which earned a score of -1. And these were things like violence committed by or against the queer character, slurs, things like that. And then I also did count neutral points, which earned a score of 0, just because I thought it was important to count the more subtle depictions, but ones that were still relevant to the queer experience. So these are the overall scores for each of my films. This is the sum of the positive and negative, and as you can see, there's actually an overall negative score for all of these films, which means there were more scenes with negative connotations than those with positive connotations. There is one outlier, which is Carol, which earned a score of 0, but that's because the number of positive and negative experiences were equal. So as for my qualitative results, in the old films, there was actually there was an unexpected amount of queer inclusion, but there was generally common plot lines of discovering one's identity, turning into self-hatred, and then eventually accepting oneself, but there wasn't a lot of depiction of societal acceptance. In those that did know about the character's sexuality, there was a decent variation in their attitudes, but there was generally an uncomfortable tone and an unfamiliarity when discussing homosexuality. For the newer films, I noticed that characters often faced struggles unrelated to their sexuality. Their identities were more of a character trait rather than a plot point, but their experiences were predominantly negative, meaning they were struggling more than they were happy. So to answer my hypothesis, there was in fact a lack of complexity in the older films. And in newer films, it did seem more normalized that the queer experience wasn't just isolated to a single character. Sexuality was more smoothly integrated into their storyline, but there wasn't more positivity. And I think these conclusions would have been really hard to come across if I hadn't compared old versus new. So that really made it clearer how we progressed. So to answer my question, how do old and new movies differ in their queer representation? The core of this, in my opinion, is that there is in complexity. The older films had generally less complexity in their characters' backgrounds and their traits and things like that. But in the newer films, there was just more depth and more motivation behind what the characters were doing and reasons behind their actions. Generally, there was also just a more sophisticated progression of their storyline, so we can see that difference in complexity. So as for implications, we can learn from future released films because now I have created a way to measure that representation and we can understand what is to be expected. Ensuring that future films are contributing to either reducing the current negativity that I've found or that they at least contain more balanced attitudes can really positively impact viewers' perceptions as we identified in the lit review. And since these differences are rooted in complexity, that complexity is really formed by those characters' backgrounds and their interactions with other characters. So maintaining that depth in character development is essential to defy those past shallow, more negative depictions. As for limitations, out of the newer films, I actually found that they each had some form of flashback or scene set in the past, and I think that might have skewed my results in terms of how directors thought of queer life today. Additionally, in But I'm a Cheerleader, it was listed as a satirical romantic comedy, which means a lot of their portrayals might have been exaggerated, especially the negative ones. They were a little self-aware in the things that they were saying, so I think those hyperbolic depictions might have skewed my negative to positive ratio. Lastly, of course, there is definitely some unconscious bias within my analysis. Even though I tried to get rid of that by doing a test data collection with a second reviewer, there's really no way to completely eliminate preconceived notions. So in the future, I would encourage directors to include more positivity in their films. Struggles are definitely important to bring awareness to, but there is in fact a lack of representation of those happier stories. As for future researchers, I would encourage them to narrow their scope of analysis. For example, they could look at only one category of my model. I analyzed 4 qualitative categories, and I think narrowing down at one might make their analysis a little more comprehensive and a little more specific. Still, as we can see here, there has definitely been a lot of progress in queer representation, but we can always continue to improve, especially as these things impact viewers every time we portray them. So now I'd like to open the panel for any questions.
You guys can go first.
Your clock is ticking.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. How did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to your final research question or project goal?
Okay, so I knew I was interested in queer representation, but I was really searching for a way to measure it because I was interested, as I said, in defining films that had this representation. So when I was doing my initial research, I noticed that a lot of these films were looking at how viewers were impacted, right? So they were saying this is good representation and it positively impacted viewers, but I really wanted to know why that was. They never really defined positive or negative, and I really wanted to dive deeper into that criteria and kind of fill in that gap of what actually defines representation. And I think using my research, in addition to how they found it impacts viewers, we can combine that to make suggestions for future directors and filmmakers.
Thank you.
What are the real-world implications or consequences related to your findings?
So as I said a little bit, now that we know how to measure representation, we can make those suggestions. I think that we can hopefully improve in the future because I've identified that complexity is really where the difference is. We've seen how complexity progresses, but now we can identify more discrepancies. One of them that I found being that negativity. But I think as researchers can continue to use my model, can refine my model as they find more important categories, we can continue to improve future film. And just while both positive and negative depictions are really important when considering film, understanding what is currently out there, right? So I found that negativity. In the future, that's going to change. So understanding what exists and how we can add to that when creating film, I think is really important. And that's an implication that will positively impact viewers in the future.
How did you handle the uncertainty of the research process?
So something I continued to do was return back to my model. I was continuously revising it, especially in something as complicated as qualitative analysis. I really wanted to make sure that I reduced as much bias as possible. So using my preliminary research, I continuously returned back to my model. I was revising the criteria that I had stated. I was making sure that I was solid in the core categories that I had chosen. So then when I actually conducted my analysis, there was something that I could return to when I was taking my observatory notes. When I was doing my analysis, I could easily compare the things that I had found to what I identified was important. So really revising that model ensured that I had a structure for how I was conducting my analysis.
Thank you.